I'm Stephen Smith, Director of the Institute for International Economic Policy here at the Elliott School. I want to welcome you to our roundtable today, From Recovery to Sustained Growth, Policymakers Challenges. Just very briefly, the Institute for International Economic Policy focuses in three main areas: international trade, international finance, and international economic development and poverty alleviation. In poverty, we have a major initiative on ultra-poverty, understanding it and addressing it. In international trade, many of you may have been at our recent event on fairer trade and freer trade. Are they compatible? Just next month, exactly 1 week from 1 month from today, we're going to be having our major conference on international financial regulation after the global crisis. And we have two other cross-cutting initiatives, one on U.S.-China international economic relations. Our third G2 and GW conference will be this October 8th. And we have a major initiative on adaptation to climate change in low-income countries. So perhaps you've been seeing our series of events on this. We're very active on events. We have had over 30 this academic year alone, but none is more important to us than this event, which we hope will be the first in a series of events that we jointly sponsor with the Growth Dialogue. We will have both the Business School and the Elliott School working together on these events. And in this regard, it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Danny Leipziger, who we were fortunate enough to draw over to George Washington University last year after a very distinguished prior career, including as Vice President for Poverty Reduction and Economic Management over in the World Bank. And he was there also the co-chair of the Commission on Growth and Development, which we are proceeding to learn more about today. Danny, welcome.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. Well, welcome to this, as Professor Smith said, first in a series of events that we hope to jointly sponsor between the Growth Dialogue, which is the successor to the Growth Commission, and GW, both at the Elliott School and the Business School where I am. There's a lot of material that you can pick up about the Growth Commission, and so I don't want to belabor that. It's all on diskette now, and I'll try to tell you a little bit about that work. But first, let me introduce our distinguished panel. At the far end and at the end of the alphabet is Sir Dwight Venner, who's the governor of the Central Bank of the Eastern Caribbean. And Sir Dwight is a commissioner, as we call him, of the Growth Commission. Next to him, the Honorable Minister of Investment of Egypt, Mahmoud Mohyeldin, who is also on the Growth Commission and has been instrumental in helping us to establish the Growth Dialogue. And then on my right, Dr. Jose de Gregorio, who's the governor of the Central Bank of Chile, a very distinguished economist and well-known throughout Latin America as well. So the task that I've asked the three speakers to address is the policy challenges after the crisis. And in that connection, I want to try to position in 5 minutes or less the work of the Growth Commission and the special report that the Growth Commission issued. The Growth Commission, you will see from the literature, involved a group of 22 policymakers and academics headed by Mike Spence, that issued a report in May of 2008 on what we know about stimulating long periods of economic growth. Unfortunately for the report, we came into the worst crisis in 100 years. Right after its release, it was unrelated, uncorrelated, and we therefore decided to do a special report, an update, which was issued in October 2009. Both of these reports are on the diskette that you have. And there's a description of a lot of other materials, including a number of books which have come out under the Growth Commission banner, Health and Growth, Poverty and Growth. This one happens to be the one I did with Spence on globalization and growth that just came out, and you can get these through the World Bank. What does a special report tell us? It tells us that We understand pretty well now the causes of the crisis, excessive risk-taking, under-regulation, and some would say a permissive Federal Reserve. We said in the report that the responses were correct, coordinated fiscal response, and a prevention through monetary policy and extraordinary liquidity of further contamination in the financial sector. In the aftermath, the big problems facing the world economies are joblessness and higher national debt, output gaps in the OECD countries, particularly, let's say, the G3, have a potential output that is 2 to 3 percentage points above what we see today, so below trend growth. And except for Asia, this is pretty much the story. We highlighted in the report the challenges facing us, resisting protectionism and overly aggressive industrial policies, how to put in place new regulations, which many of my colleagues on the right have been involved with over the last weekend here in Washington in the G20 and IMF World Bank meetings, and how to deal with capital restrictions or capital flows, and in some countries dealing with income distribution, particularly in the U.S., which is highly unequal at the moment. The report also stressed the importance of strong government action, even without being in a crisis, for the maintenance of high growth, and the importance of coherence, greater coherence in international management, by which we mean the new emerging economies need to be brought into the management of the system in a more healthy way. So this report came out, this special report, at a moment of greater introspection, I would say, where people are looking at the effectiveness of the export-led growth model, the role of exchange rates, particularly in China, the role of industrial policy. Danny Roderick has had some interesting views on this of late. And it's forcing us to re-examine our priors, but not all of our priors are wrong. So in the growth report and in the special report, there's a special section called Bad Ideas, and it seems to be very popular because people like to know not only what should be done, but what should be avoided. This is also a great moment of policy challenge because global output is below trend, capital flows less reliable, economic nationalism, some would say, on the rise, and policymakers face these difficulties. So we brought to you 3 policymakers who face these practical problems every day, and I've asked each of them to speak for no longer than 15 minutes. We are being taped, and this will be available on GW's web and the Elliott School website and streamed to various places. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to Jose de Gregorio to give us a sense of the policy challenges of Chile, apart from the earthquake, of course, but also for Latin America more generally. Jose.
Thank you very much, Danny. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation. While Danny was giving his introduction, and he said that they just issued a report on growth just before the crisis. And he said there is no correlation. And I used to have a professor that said, with one data point, you cannot run a regression. But I found 2 data points. Because in 1996, the World Bank issued a very nice book about the East Asian miracle, just a year before the East Asian crisis. So I think that we could run a regression with the probability of having a crisis the year after. In Washington, there is an issue of what to do to success. But of course, so let me know when you write a book about Chile.
1 year ahead.
Right, just after I lived, so don't worry. So now, the question is, and this has, of course, puzzled me for many years, what do we know to make growth sustain? And we used to, for a long time, to write a list and to think and to argue and to say this kind, and of course, things that are very important, inequality, institutions, and so on. But there is one thing that I think that is extremely important, and over time it's not because of my job too, but I have become almost obsessed, and it's the fact that a key variable for growth is macroeconomic and financial stability. I think that that's essential. I wrote some papers and published some stuff some years ago, but I think that is, as we just look around the world, is extremely important. And this leads me to 2 points that I would like to talk about in this presentation. First, about the crisis, and to argue that the crisis was a huge crisis, but was extremely well managed after the crisis. Then we can discuss about the causes of the crisis. So it was extremely well managed, as something that would have been as deep as the Great Depression turned out to be one order of magnitude less. And the second point, I will go to the challenges in emerging market regarding the macro environment. So with regard to the crisis, the origins, I won't discuss too much. I do not think that it's just detail whether the monetary policy was expansionary or not in the US, because in Chile, in Canada, in Australia, there were policies as expansionary as the ones that were followed by the Fed, and we didn't have financial crisis. So I think that's much more related to problems in the financial system, with the financial infrastructure that led to the crisis. Although, let me just make you one point. I think that the strategy of, which was also known as the standard strategy to deal with bubbles and with rapid asset prices increases, that was basically known as the Greenspan put. You know, you just let them grow, you don't do anything about them, and if there is a collapse, you loosen monetary policy. I think that that could be a cause for having asset price bubbles. But it's not the level of the interest rate, but rather the strategy that you follow, which induces a lot of moral hazard problems, because investors know that if there is a crisis, the Fed will come up. And this happened in Black Monday in '87, was inaugurated in Black Monday, with LTCM. It happened in September 11. So then the bubble is so big that if you lose a monetary policy, you are unable to avoid the crisis, which was what happened with the housing bubble. I think that's really a problem. Now, what I think that is very interesting and to realize, and this is not just the case of Chile, it's the case of all emerging markets. I don't want to say we did it worse or better than other countries, is that for the first time, emerging markets, in particular Latin America, faces a global crisis, and instead of amplifying the crisis, it was reduced. We had a recession, but for the first time, we didn't fall more than the rest of the world, which is a typical case. When there was a Volcker adjustment of the 80s, there was a recession in the world, in the US, and we have a depression. Then it happened even with the Asian crisis. Today, I would say it's the first time that in Latin America, in emerging markets, the effects of the crisis were much more limited. For two reasons. First of all, because the epicenter of the crisis was not in emerging market. So but remember that the Volcker, it was not also in emerging markets. And the Asian crisis was in Asia, but was not in Latin America, and we suffer a lot. So that's a fair point to start. But the second one, I think, that we have learned the hard way, the importance of having a strong financial system and having sound macroeconomic policies. Although macroeconomic policies are different across countries, even within Latin America, we have a lot of dispersion. There is one thing that I think that even from populist to non-populist government, from left to right, we know that low inflation is important, to be sustainable on the budget, and to be careful about financial. I think that that's sort of a common ground in which was based the ability of most countries to have a very expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. There has been many papers over the last couple of decades on the procyclicality of policies in Latin America, because we were used to, when there was a financial crisis, we have to tighten because there was no financing to do expansionary policy. So policies tend out to be to aggravate the cycles. But now, for the first time, I would say, all around the world, policies help to soften and to act contra the cyclically regarding to the cycle. Even something that I think that's very interesting, and this goes a bit more to some of Danny's point, and I wouldn't, even when the world is much more open, there was the impression, and many years ago, that as the world becomes more open, economies becomes more vulnerable. Of course, if you see at the data, very open economies suffer somewhat more with the initial impact of the crisis. But first, if you try to look at the big significant difference, there is no difference on openness around the world. And in a world that is open, so global, so integrated, a financial shock, the size of the shock of the Great Depression had much less effects on economic activity and on a recession. I always mention that I was very impressed by some data by Barry Eichengreen and Kevin O'Rourke on the beginnings of it's on Boxeo somewhere in the website, that the initial impact on asset prices, on trade, on industrial production, the first couple of quarters of the recent crisis and the Great Depression were almost the same. According to Ben Bernanke, this crisis was even financially was most costly originally than the Great Depression. And according to the Bank of England, the financial crisis that they had, literally they said, is the worst in the last 100 years. So you have to go before, I don't know British history, but you have to go before the Great Depression to find a big crisis. But the effect, and as we have seen how the world has recovered, is quite impressive. And this also is a consolation for economists because we failed miserably predicting the crisis, but I think that we were quite decent in managing the crisis. And this has to do more things, but I won't talk about that. That is a reflection on the crisis and we as a profession. Let me make some remarks about the challenges facing macroeconomic policies. There are a lot of issues. In Chile, we have an earthquake. There are pending problems of inequality. There are problems of jobs in the recovery. But I want to focus on some macro issues. The first point, which is very important, is how will be done the exit strategies from the fiscal and monetary stimulus. From the fiscal stimulus, I think that it's essential to devise in all countries a coherent way to exit from the fiscal stimulus. Why? Because we have the example of Greece, countries that down the road find that they are not solvent, that they have problems of financing, and it creates a lot of problems to refinance and to make a sustainable fiscal program, so you have to start tightening a lot. And if this happens at the global level, what we will have is a huge increase in interest rate around the world, which will have a very damaging effects on the recovery. So it's quite important, I think, especially for countries that have increased, that have too big the fiscal stimulus, but also that have high levels of debt. So at the end, this may have serious problems. Then it comes the problem which is more related for most emerging markets, that is the monetary, the exit from the monetary policy, which is very expansionary. And what's the problem that we have? That the recovery is being very heterogeneous. Emerging markets are growing very fast. We know that growing fast or are recovering fast will bring inflationary pressures, and we know that inflationary pressures will need a tightening of monetary policy. But if the world and developed countries and the industrial world is still with very low interest rate because they are not growing, we will start having large interest rate differentials, pressures on appreciation on emerging markets, and a lot of capital inflows to emerging markets, and that's a problem. So it's not a problem, I would say, per se, but it could bring a lot of financial vulnerabilities, asset price bubbles, and then the traditional boom-bust in emerging market economies. So I think that's I would say today is the main challenge. And let me just mention a couple of things how to deal with them, because then it comes the discussion of what to do, because there is some increase in capital inflows still reaching the levels of 2006. So it's not boom, but they have recovered from what they were during the crisis. Capital inflows to emerging markets, some appreciation in some countries with a pretty large appreciation. And so it comes what authorities should do. And let me just mention a couple of things. First of all, monetary policy can deal with that to a first approximation. Why? Because if you have a strong appreciation, persistent appreciation, the appreciation will have effects on inflation, moderate effect. We know that they were not huge effects as we thought in the past, but they have effects on inflation, and this for inflation targeting regime for countries that orient monetary policy towards price stability, this allows to have an expansionary monetary policy. So as you loosen monetary policy or you don't rise too fast interest rate, what you will have will be a less pressures on the appreciation. So monetary policy acts in a way lean against the wind regarding capital inflows and appreciation. What's the risk, someone can say, is that anyway, in this scenario of an appreciated exchange rate, loose monetary policy will have too much growth and the economy can overheat. If there is no inflation, we can discuss whether that's true or not. But then there are other instruments as fiscal policy that can help. But I don't want, as a central banker, say that the solution has to come from fiscal policy. I think that that's a shortcut, which is not reasonable, at least from our point of view to say it. But what we have to be careful is the traditional story, and this is, in the US there is a long discussion, and there will be a discussion, whether you have to avoid bubbles by tightening monetary policy. This is kind of the conventional criticism, that the Fed should have tightened much more, and we wouldn't have had the mortgage bubble. But in our case, the housing bubble, in our case is worse, because if you are having a bubble, and what's the bubble in emerging market is that everybody wants to get in, the currency appreciate, and all asset prices go up. So if you tighten, you create more incentive for capital inflow. So it goes exactly the other way around. And so what we should do, so if this doesn't work, the second area where we can do something is with exchange rate intervention. And it has fiscal costs, it has to be something extremely exceptional, because otherwise you become addicted, and it's very ineffective. So you have to, and it has to be extremely massive. That I think that in a way can help. It does not help to change the broad trends, but it changes when market sentiments push the exchange rate too far away from fundamental. There is a very much discussed about capital controls. I don't think that they are dependent on the country. So one always has to say one size does not fit all, but as countries integrate with the rest of the world, they become very ineffective. So many times the problem with the capital controls is that you think that you are isolated, you think that you can increase interest rate, you think that you won't have capital inflows, but you have all of that. And we have it in Chile. I always quote as just an example. In the time that we are the poster child for capital controls, and it's very impressive that officials from Chile are not that fan of capital controls. But it's interesting because the year that we have the tightest capital controls, which was about 97, we accumulate like 5% of reserves, so 5% of GDP, huge amount of reserves. The tightest capital controls and exchange rate ban, we have the most appreciated exchange rate of the last 25 years. So it's kind of very difficult to think now. You say, well, the contrafactually, you wouldn't have that. Perhaps it could have been more appreciated. I think I would contend that if we haven't had that, we couldn't have the monetary policy that was with two-digit nominal interest rate. So that's what what I think that is at the core of these bubbles. And finally, I think that what is important, if we want really think seriously about capital controls, I think that we have to look at measures not in terms of reducing capital inflows that they may come in many ways, or what's happened to the exchange rate, but looking at them as a financial regulation tool. How we make sure that with some form of controls or taxation or regulation, we make sure that the mismatches of currencies in the banking system and too much mismatch in maturities does not pose a threat to the stability of the financial system. In that way, I think that we can think. Just one other comment. The tightest capital controls that Chile had were in 1982 for the debt crisis, and we fall 16%. We have huge run on the currency and was pretty ineffective. But what we can think, and one thing that one can say about the virtues of capital control in Chile is that they lengthen the maturity of external debt. So if we think that that's something that's good because it makes you less vulnerable, what you should do is to do something with taxation or regulation in the financial system to make sure that that's what you really want. So I'll stop here. I think that my time and
Thank you very much. Minister Mohildeen.
Right. Thank you so much. It's indeed an honor for me to be with you here today and to be invited to this distinguished panel and to address you and share with you some of the challenges we are facing in the formulation of economic policies and executing them in very interesting times indeed. We are not really talking just about the aftermath of the financial crisis, while the financial crisis taken very good attention by academicians, the media, and the different Gs that we have, the G8 and recently the G20. We shouldn't really forget that the developing countries were exposed to equally serious external shocks well before the financial crisis. The food crisis back in 2006 and 2007, and the fuel crisis, the huge increases in the oil prices and their impact on development and on the price levels and on subsidies of energy. So one could say with comfort that developing countries were not really lucky with the letter F of the finance, of food, and the fuel crises. And with this kind of background, and while we should be really engaged in the current debate related to best policies and best measures to deal with the financial crisis, because while I agree that there had been a great deal of improvement during the last few months, we cannot really say that the financial system is secure. And there are many problems still associated with the very causes of the financial crisis. If we just remind ourselves of the main causes, the excessive leverage in the financial institutions, the lack of unified rules for the quality and level of capital, and still today people are talking about regulatory arbitrage and what is the best way to regulate and supervise financial institutions, and there are different reform packages, including in the US, being proposed to deal with the problem without really getting them through yet. And there is the issue of the weakness in risk and liquidity management. And it's too early that we can be sure that at the micro level of financial institutions that they reached some good solutions in these aspects. I'd like to add to that what had been emphasized by Professor Schiller recently, this issue of the absence of financial literacy and absence of financial infrastructure in developed countries. And if this is relevant for developed countries and very much responsible for the subprime mortgage crisis in the US, one could say that this could be more relevant to developing countries that are not very much acquainted with some of the rules of engagement with financial services. So this issue, while we are seeing some improvement in financial indicators, and we cannot really say that we secured the financial sector. And actually, with the problems mentioned by Governor De Gregorio related to problems with some sovereigns of the developed world, there's going to have some repercussions on some of the financial institutions unless they are fully dealt with. And the issue of dealing with Greece in particular, it had these dimensions of possible negative spillover effect and signaling effects related to other countries that could be as vulnerable of the countries belonging to the European zone and the Southern Europe in particular, and the exposure of creditors in different countries and mainly in Europe again. So we're basically under threat of seeing another stage of the development of the crisis if the issue of Greece was not really dealt with. And still, with the current debate and what you see daily about the mechanism of rescue and the bailing out and all of that, still making many investors around the world are not really very much comfortable in investing in some of the developed countries' papers because they cannot really identify fully the kind of risk profiles associated with them. And while you could really identify the risk of many emerging markets and developing countries, and if you are not happy with the risk, you are going to be paid adequately through the spread over TBs. In some of the developed countries, the problem is not really that explicit, especially that there is a new definition now of some of the developed countries that they are these countries that are learning how to be fiscally irresponsible and get away with it and get others to share with them the costs of bailing out. So this is a great deal of a problem here. And now I think reference to history is very good in this stage. When we're talking about different countries, the first world and the second world and the third world, while the developed countries should be belonging to the first world, and the second world has just vanished after 1989, the talk today is about the disappearance of the third world. There is no third world as such, not because their countries disappeared, but there are many countries now of the third world are being treated today as developed countries through their presence in the trade markets globally, through their presence in the financial activities and different aspects of developments associated with that. So these crises are not just an incident or a shock and things are going to be back to normal. Nothing is going to be back to normal. These could be very much like wars, like the First and Second World Wars. They are going to be resulting in winners and losers. They are going to be reaffirming positions of some of the countries all over the world. The talk for almost 3 decades now about the future role of China, India, and other countries in Asia today is being reaffirmed by their increase in the relative position globally. Well, the problem for developing countries, especially with the countries with small open economies like the Egyptian one, and many other countries in Latin America and Asia, with the exception of China and India and a couple of others, big economies, it's basically as follows. Regardless the effort you are doing at home to fix the house, to apply the rules, to follow the best standards, and to follow the best regulations, in the time of the crisis, this may minimize, but not to eliminate, the exposure to risk. It's like having a good, well-built, small boat, and you are facing a perfect storm. So while many of the reports coming from the Bretton Woods institutions are praising the efforts of many of the developing countries that they managed to avoid the worst of the financial crisis. Many of them did that because of good efforts of financial reforms. Many of their banks were already hospitalized during the crisis, so they were not exposed to the trouble. Many other developing countries didn't even have a bank to be exposed to risk whatsoever. It's like congratulating somebody not to have a car accident simply because he didn't really have a car to drive. So this is not really an issue of being a careful driver or even lucky. It's an issue of poverty and not being exposed or integrated with the rest of the world as such. If these are the problems with the crisis, some of the problems are associated with some of the cures, as mentioned by Dr. Lipzager, related to some of the cures that had been adopted in some countries. And the effort today is how to coordinate policies better, how to avoid protectionism, how to resist the constraints and repressions facing capital flows. But it's inevitable, really, to see that even after all of these strong statements of endorsement of globalization coming out from the G20, we have seen that at least 17 out of the 19 members of the G20 adopting protectionist measures. The issue of public debt is very serious and goes beyond really its impact on the countries that are being affected by it. If you check the figures of the G7 countries, their public debt to GDP today is very close to the levels of public debt during the Second World War and after that, during like the late 40s and early 50s of last century. And how this is going to be paid out. What are the repercussions of that if they are going to be resorting to some inflationary measures in dealing with the issue? And this is going to be exported in a way to other countries around the globe, or could have as well a sort of a global crowding out effect that you are not going to be seeing capital flowing nicely and smoothly to emerging markets and developing countries as it used to be in the past. The other thing that I like really to share with you, that there is a great deal of confusion about the best course of action to be undertaken as far as the economic policies are concerned. The crisis is not just in the economy. The crisis very much, and we're talking within an academic, respectable institution, that the crisis is not just there in the economy and in the commercial activities, but it's very much in the economic thinking. And sometimes you feel that there is some sort of confusion resulting in some unnecessary measures and being fed as well sometimes by populist approaches by some of the developed countries. We are seeing now some very negative and confusing signals coming out from a variety of policymakers. It's not an issue of flexibility or being pragmatic. There is an issue of confusion at large. So as far as we are really working together in this issue of coordination mentioned by Governor De Gregorio, it's basically very important now just to see what is the best way of getting things done. Back again to this issue of growth. We had problems of growth before the crisis, and we're having more problems with growth after the crisis. We need to secure the financial sectors of the world and to maintain financial stability in order to maintain whatever we have today of growth. And given that despite some growth here and there, we are very much below the levels of output that were there before the crisis. What kind of a financial system that we like to have? What kind of sophistication that we require there? And I think it's the issue that we don't really need financial institutions or banks to be adequately regulated and to congratulate them for their safety and soundness. We need these banks to deal with the basic rules related to mobilization of savings and allocating them to investment and to help us growing. And this kind of a function is very much being missed in many of the activities of financial institutions, despite the fact that they are doing well, despite the fact that some of them are doing great even after the crisis by a few months, and some of them were just rescued by public money. They are doing fine as far as their returns on equity and income and assets are concerned. But are they doing really enough to finance development and economic activities. This is something that we need to be considering. This is beyond some of the reform packages being considered today. This is beyond taxing those who are being paid more than the acceptable averages. It's basically getting the banking sectors and the financial intermediaries back to the old conventional functions of funding growth and development. With this issue in mind, it's a good reminder to see really the Growth Commission with some great relevance even after the crisis, because there are some obvious lessons that we have been learning from many countries around the world, especially in Asia, in sustaining growth for more than 25 years. The issues related to political stability, economic stability, investment and saving, and the investment in human capital and investment in infrastructure, all of that had been reflected in the report. And I don't think there isn't really much of disagreements about these pillars. They are still very relevant. What could be really questionable today of the 5 pillars endorsed by the growth commissions is the 5th one related to the issue of globalization and integration with the rest of the world, the role of FDI and the export-oriented activities. And it's very hard today, and as a Minister of Investment, I cannot really see it as easy as it used to be to attract some investments for some export-oriented sectors. It's becoming very difficult now. So we need to think of new means of enhancing growth, on more reliance on domestic demand, more reliance on investments in infrastructure, and avoid the bad ideas mentioned earlier. Some of them are today being adopted, like having subsidy on energy and trying to abandon the outward policies, or having some assumptions about that whatever of effort that we are going to be undertaking today is going to be helping us going back to the pre-crisis conditions. The world is changing. The role of Asia in particular is very much upon us, with increases in their shares, the Asian countries, of GDP, of stock markets. And if you just consider the figures, back in 1980, the Asian share of the global GDP was around 18%. Now we're talking about 35% and growing. And these kinds of improvements in shares do not come free of values and free of politics associated with them. So we're not going to be seeing the world as it used to be. There is going to be major changes and values and emphasis of them, and competition between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. So what's going to be of relevance then to a developing country like Egypt in the middle, basically try to maximize the benefits of such competition in the future and try to continue with the reforms at home and hoping for better environment for emerging markets and the globe at large to do better in attracting investments and do better in sustaining growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Let me make a couple of remarks on the Growth Commission itself. This is the 3rd commission in living memory. The first was chaired by a former Canadian Prime Minister, the second one by Willy Brandt, and coming long after this particular one. And the title, the Growth Report, Strategies for Sustained Growth and Inclusive Development, is a very interesting one. The composition of this commission differed, I think, substantially from the others. There were more political appointees on the first 2. This had a more technocratic bent, which was chaired by Mike Spence, who was a Nobel laureate in economics, and Bob Solow was also on it. But for the rest, it consisted of a lot of practitioners, and I think there was a very practical bent to what the commission did. I think the opening to the academic community was substantial. We had over 300 academics appear, not before us, but with us, to discuss these issues. And of course, there are many, many points of view expressed. But it was inclusive in the end from the point of view that 4 special types of countries were singled out. For example, the African countries, small states like our own, countries with natural resources, and middle-income countries for various reasons. My remit is to speak about the group of 8 small countries in the Eastern Caribbean, the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, which have had an integration arrangement of functional cooperation since 1981, and a common currency and central bank, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, since 1983. This currency union is one of only 3 such currency arrangements in the international community, the others being the French, West and East African currency boards, and as well, of course, the Eurozone, which is very much in the news these days. The small states of Eastern Caribbean have special characteristics, as pointed out in the growth report, which have been exacerbated by the economic crisis. These states are extremely open and vulnerable to external shocks and natural disasters. In the period leading up to the crisis, they were severely affected by the dramatic rise in 2 important commodities, namely oil and food. These increases had a marked impact on their balance of payments. In fact, if you, in our position, importing most things that you have to use to consume or for capital reasons, this can be very significant. The global financial crisis which followed immediately after and compounded the difficulties of these countries had 3 specific channels of transmission to these countries. A fall in the numbers of tourist arrivals and expenditures, a severe decline in direct foreign investment due to the credit crunch in the United States, and a marked fall in remittances from citizens living in the US, UK, and Canada. The continuing problem for these countries is that economic events in the United States, which is their main trading partner and to which our currency is linked, is that there's a 12 to 18-month lag with the movements with our economies. And consequently, while the US has shown significant signs of recovery, the currency union is still in the throes of a deep downturn. High unemployment in the US and the rebalancing of balance sheets in that country continue to have an impact on our currency union economies, as projected by the IMF. Output in the ECCU contracted by 7.4% in 2009, and it's projected to fall further by 2.4% in 2010. Recovery is not expected until 2011, so we still have to go through the agony of at least another year in the downslope. The narrow economic base is being severely impacted by what is effectively a 10% contraction in 2 years. Government revenues have declined by approximately 20% over the last 6 months, and this has led to a deterioration in the debt-to-GDP ratios of many member countries. And in fact, the debt-to-GDP ratio is already over 100% in the last 3 of them. 2 other issues have added to the difficulties facing the currency union. There have been major challenges in the financial sector, with the collapse of 2 major and related regional insurance companies, which is the equivalent of AIG in the regional sense. These companies had large exposures to banks and credit unions, as well as companies and individuals who bought their products for pension purposes. There was also a run on a domestic commercial bank owned by the Texan investor Alan Stanford, who was charged with financial malpractices by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, thus precipitating a run on that bank. The central bank had to intervene in this bank under its emergency powers to prevent contagion in the national banking system of Antigua and Barbuda, with the host country, and ultimately the other members of the currency union. The final issue facing the currency union, which has been exacerbated by the crisis, has been the secular decline in economic growth. This has been recorded at 6% in the 1980s, 3% in the 1990s, and just hovering around 1% or negative at the current time. These growth rates have been influenced by the following: preference erosion, which affected the currency union's agricultural export commodities. There are arrangements, trade arrangements with the EU, but these have been eroded by the WTO, who has ruled against these preferences. Secondly, massive destruction of infrastructure and housing stock by natural disasters, for example, hurricanes and volcanoes, in the period between the mid-1990s, and the early years of the new millennium. And finally, low productivity, as the countries go through the transition from the old industries to the new. So the countries are sort of in an interregnum now as you move from agricultural commodity production to services, mainly tourism and finance. The response of the currency union has been in two major areas. One, to accelerate the progress to a new and highly advanced stage of integration, namely an economic union. And two, the development of an 8-point stabilization and growth program as an immediate response to the crisis. The economic union process started in 2002 and is almost complete with the sign of the new treaty on December 29, 2009, and barring incidents, its ratification by the respective parliaments in June 2010. This new treaty will supersede the original treaty of 1981. There are three advantages for this new treaty brings, and this treaty will lead to a single economic and financial space. One, the potential for economies of scale in production, marketing, distribution, and public administration. Two, the spread of the risks across a wider geographic space and a larger population. And three, greater negotiating capacity with third countries or groups of countries. There will be enhanced consolidation in critical service areas. For example, the judiciaries share a common judiciary, common central bank, and currency. The regulation of banks, securities, civil aviation, and telecommunications is done on a regional basis. And there's joint procurement by the countries of pharmaceuticals and other critical public good commodities. New areas of joint activities are envisaged in the following areas: audit, statistics, a competition authority, enlargement and consolidation of regulatory arrangements to include, in addition to telecoms, electricity, water. A revenue authority, combining all the tax authorities, and integrating the regional police and prison services. The new treaty envisages a dual system of government and governance to facilitate the close coordination of economic and financial policies across the currency union in order to achieve the development goals of the different countries. The goals have been set as followed, consistent with the Growth Commission goals. A growth rate of 7%, which we hope to sustain over a significant period of time, reducing unemployment, which is now in double digits, to below 4%, and poverty levels to be reduced below 4%. The human development indices that have been set up by the UN, these countries maintain pretty high human development indices. One thing that is a geographical as well as historical arrangement. These are former British colonies where the rule of law is very strong, liberal democracy is strong. It's in an area close to the United States of America. It's not like the Pacific Islands, which are far away. And therefore, there's a demonstration effect not only in consumption, but also in the principles of democracy. The immediate response to the crisis was the development of an 8-point stabilization and growth program. This program addresses fiscal and debt sustainability and financial sector stability. The components 1 to 5 of the fiscal and debt system will be financial programming, fiscal reform, debt management, public sector investment programs, and social safety nets. The countries are working very closely with the International Monetary Fund using a variety of programs which they can access. The World Bank, the Regional Development Bank, the Caribbean Development Bank, and the development partners who include the European Union, CEDA, the Canadians, the British, Venezuela, and China, both sides. These countries have a unique foreign policy. 3 of them recognize China and 3 Taiwan. Very interested, in fact, probably the most successful two-China policy in recent times. In theory, as the currency union, we have a similar problem to Greece. However, in practice, we have established clear domestic arrangements on collaboration and collective action through safety nets and joint regulation, and in our working relations with the International Monetary Fund. There's been a strong adjustment effort, but this has now been constrained by a lack of fiscal space. There is no room for fiscal stimulus, as seen in developed countries, or social safety net protection, which must come from external sources and are contingent on the strength of our prior and independent efforts at adjustment. With respect to financial stability, the countries have enhanced their regulatory framework and expanded the scope of regulation to the non-bank sector, which is formerly very much unregulated. There's a need for structural changes to the banking and insurance sectors, which are already in train with respect to consolidation of these sectors. The time frame for the adjustment program is 2010 to 2012, and the period for structural transformation or transformation of the economy is 2020, the time frame, a time from which we hope we will meet. The problems that small countries face, as Danny was hinting, tremendous. When the crisis hit in the United States of America, and it's, as one of our colleagues said, it's the first time that a crisis has emanated from that source. This is a very frightening thing for countries which depend for direct foreign investment, tourists, and other things of the sort from this source. And I think Mohamed made the point that sometimes if you're not fully integrated in the international system, that provides some measure of comfort and protection. But the whole point of the Growth Commission report is the integration into the world economy. Small countries cannot develop on a domestic basis, and therefore we have to see in the international community what are the international public goods, one of which must be financial stability, which would allow countries to participate and prosper in this environment. So the jury is now out. The program of activities during the last week with the fund and the bank were very interesting from the point of view of the power shift in the international economy, how the changes are going to be made to the management of the fund and the bank, as well as the programs which developed countries and the international financial institutions will put in place to soften or provide some resilience to smaller countries in the international system. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you join me in thanking